good to me. Every day gets sweeter, every day gets better, 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 every day gets sweeter, every day gets better. You are good. In the morning I'll say you are good. In the evening I'll say you are good. You are good to me.
Good morning. Welcome to Park City. My name is Kristen, and it is such a joy to be here with you this morning. At this time, we're going to take just a really quick break, and we're going to let all our kiddos be dismissed to go to their class. And while they do that, say hello to a neighbor. And also, we are going to take communion this morning. So if you want to grab the elements, there's a basket over here and a basket over here on this table, and we'll be back in just a minute. this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. 'Cause Jesus paid it all. Oh, to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. My sin had left a crimson stain. He washed crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise. Psalm 62 says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him? Like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this. That power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work."
It's obviously a theme in the psalm this morning, right? For God alone my soul waits in silence, which prompted all sorts of thoughts from my end as we reflect on the scripture this morning. Immediately I went to like Simon and Garfunkel. Any fans? Yeah, I thought about just having you look at your neighbor and play the quiet game, but that could be awkward, I guess. But like hello darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. So some of you guys are like, yeah, big fans? No? Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. Do you guys want to sing it? And the vision that was planted, no? In my brain still remains within the... There we go, right? Yes, silence. I feel like silence conjures up all sorts of feelings. I think an initial reaction, which we've referenced this with regards to rest a few weeks ago. On the one hand, I think silence for many of us is terrifying, right? This is the territory, the landscape of like every suspense and horror movie, right? Like silence. They play all the sort of ominous feelings of that come with silence. I mean, yes, many of you. Okay, awesome. Some of you guys saw The Quiet Place, maybe, or like this. I saw an interview where the director sort of talked about like in a world where he had to like sound was the villain, and talked about sound being like a character in the movie, and silence sort of its antithesis, right? Silence, I think, for many of us, and we talked about this. When life gets quiet enough that like the volume of our interior life can be heard uninterrupted, it can be a little terrifying. So it's sort of that space of silence. But I also thought, oftentimes you guys know the feeling like we talk about awkward silence, right? Like when you're making small talk with someone or trying to get to know someone, and we resist that pause with everything within us, right? We will fill it with whatever we can because the awkwardness of that silence. But that awkward silence doesn't just live in those sort of more surface level spaces. Maybe you have felt that in sort of the more deeply meaningful relationships in your life where there's tension or conflict. And now where there used to be sort of free-flowing communication, there is oftentimes awkward is too soft a word, but there is a silence that is uncomfortable and thick with tension and strife, an awkward silence. But I also thought, like, we also hear the phrase, maybe. Do we hear the phrase? I don't know. Silence is golden. Deafening? Oh, yeah, that's a good one. That would fall under the, like, terrifying silence. But golden is what I was aiming for. So you guys win. Sorry, buddy. Your bracket's busted. But This sort of silence as like this virtuous thing, right? That which Scripture celebrates this. Generally, all sorts of sort of philosophical traditions talk about the value of silence, it being this golden thing. But sometimes I think we sort of turn that into like it's like a punishment. I thought of like sort of culturally sort of bygone eras of like, children were to be seen but not heard, right? Silence is golden in the sense of it's sort of kind of keeping someone in their place. In that sense, it becomes harmful. But when we read our psalm this morning, for you, God alone, my soul waits in silence. We hear silence as a kind of gift. It is not something we create or manufacture. It's this gift. It's the framework, really. We've seen this pattern in previous psalms. If we think of the psalm as like a lattice on which things can grow, or a scaffolding that sort of holds the structure, this refrain is repeated twice. In verse 1, for God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. And then again, lest we forget in verse 5, for God alone, again, we're holding this as a prayer, for God alone, O my soul. Now it's a command. Wait in silence, for my hope is from him. Becomes this structure on which hangs everything. In fact, I think all of the ensuing sort of constituent parts of this psalm find their home in these two refrains as they're repeated. For God alone. The implication is I could be looking in all kinds of places for security, but in this moment, for God alone. And these spaces will be explored in the prayer, but in this moment, God alone, my soul waits in silence. This raises the question, well, what do we find there? What inhabits that quiet, silent space? Well, from him comes salvation. And as the prayer continues, it will put flesh on this expression of security. So I want us to consider, we're just going to consider the psalm as we move through it here, and then we're going to close with a song and a prayer of silence and communion before we dismiss this morning. That's where we're headed. And really, I just want to hold the psalm kind of around three words, and the first one is where we have started, silence. But then we're going to consider how the psalm sort of suggests to us that the silence of this psalm, was that alliteration? I don't know. The silence of this psalm is situated, I'll stop, but it has a context. So we're going to consider the context of the silence that we are invited into in the psalm, but also the content that we find there. So that's the direction we're headed. So we start with silence, which we've read already. Verses 1 and 5 repeat the refrain, and then they put a bit of flesh on there that in this silence, why? What's the motivation here? Where I want to suggest that in this prayer of Psalm 62, we are drawn into sort of relinquishing any sort of self-reliance. That wrapped up in these two invitations to silence, these confessions, is an admission, that I am not nearly as reliable as I think. Is an invitation to give up any sort of self-sufficiency. Right? For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. And then the development here in verse 2. Why? Because he alone is my rock. He alone is my salvation, my fortress, as we've sung this morning. It's the security in my life is found in him. Because of him, I shall not be greatly shaken. And then the same theme is repeated in verse 5. For God alone, my soul, wait in silence. Why? From him my hope comes. And then it develops it with the same language. He is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. Trust in him, then the invitation. Well, to trust in him at all times. Pour out your heart before him because he is a refuge. What I want us to hear as we consider the first word, silence, this morning, is that this is an invitation to you and me to sort of give up the game of self-reliance. The security, the path in your life, all of the planning and managing, all of the goals, all those things are necessary and important. We want to grow and we want to work and we strive. We do all these things, but the prayer, the invitation of this psalm is first to recognize that all of that isn't sort of what gives us weight, as we'll see in a moment. That our security doesn't lie in our own abilities, our own determinations, or the opinions of others, as we'll see in a moment, but it rests in God alone. Silence in this sense is a confession, right? a confession as I come to the end of my words that my life depends on the words of another. Right? That my life doesn't depend on sort of what I can manufacture, that my life and the security that I am invited into depends on the word of another. I've mentioned Wendell Berry in here before. He's a farmer from Kentucky and has written prolifically. I enjoy his fiction very much. If you, Jayber Crow is a fun one, a good place to start. But he's written some poems on silence, and one in particular, the language I feel like sort of resonates with the feeling of the psalm. He's writing about nature, and maybe that's your quiet place. You sort of like to step out into a world where you are small and creation is big. But he says, though the air is full of singing, my head is loud with the labor of words. This tension that we feel, that we are pulled, invited into silence to give up sort of our self-sufficient tug and rely on the word of another. But the reality is that our hearts and lives are full of all kinds of chatter, which brings me to the second word. If the first word is silence, the second word I want us to consider is noise, right? Noise. We heard a drum in the kids' room just a few moments ago. Noise. We have made a joyful noise in song this morning. Noise. Your life perhaps is full of all kinds of noises. Well, the context of this psalm suggests that silence that you are invited into, that we are invited into, this silence of trusting God as our security, in the psalm admittedly comes with its own bit of noisy context. We see this developed in verses 3 and 4. And then in the second sort of section in verses 9 and 10. Right, verses 3 and 4, how long? So he's just declared, I will rest. My soul will trust silently in God who is my salvation. And then in verse 3, how long will all of you, his eyes come down and he's looking around at the world around him. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him? Like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. And then this beautiful line, they bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. There's a lot going on here. And I don't know if this is sort of the language of your prayer life, right? As you pray like this, to pray this would feel perhaps a little foreign. But I think one author has suggested, a scholar has suggested that the sort of wrapped up in this language is once again a critique, if you will, of a world that's built on sort of asserting yourself, right? That here the prayer, David, the author, right, praying this prayer is confessing, man, there are all these systems in the world, the pressure I feel in the world where it's like you assert yourself, get ahead. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse, almost as if there is this push in his world that on the surface seems to be like an invitation to success or encouragement, a way to get ahead in the world, but he discovers it to be sort of selfishly motivated. Sort of a bait and switch, if you will. Blessed with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. This feeling, I don't know, this feels really cynical, but it made me think of like Super Bowl commercials, right? All the spaces in which, in our lives, in which we are sort of advertised to, like given a hook, man, if this thing were a part of your life, then, right, the security you're looking for would be materialized in this way. But underneath all of that, again, I know this is really cynical, underneath all of that is this sort of same bait and switch that we see here. It sounds like a blessing from the mouth, but inwardly there are other ulterior, selfish motives at play here. And you feel in the psalm as he's looking for silence, a place for rest from this relentless sort of pressure in his world. You hear the invitation to silence within this context. But there's a second sort of context in verses 9 and 10. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. And once again, it feels like in the prayer, he's looking at the world around him and all the ways in which the world suggests this is how you advance. This is how you add weight and significance to your life. These are exposed for being less than advertised, full of bravado and emptiness. We read it, and I think we read this first verse, verse 9. Those of low estate are but a breath. Culturally, our world, its values, like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Right? The people of low estate have less value. That's the way the world functions. It's the way systems function. It's oftentimes that we don't want to admit, right? It's just the way our hearts are drawn to operate. That makes sense to us. But then we read, he also prays those of high estate are also a delusion. That none of these things have weight. That all the ways in which we assign value, so that's not really where that significance lies. It uses the imagery of balances, right? The economy in the day. You wanted to buy a pound of rice, you added the weights, you got the pound, then you put the rice in until the scales were even, and that's how you knew you had the right value. And in this moment of prayer, as he's invited into silence, as you and I are invited into silence, we hear sort of called into question the way in which we balance what's valuable in life and who. Right? That all the things we want to push into that scale, all the things you and I want to sort of heap onto that scale to sort of show that our lives have value and significance. This psalmist in this prayer, again, suggests that maybe all of those things you and I are pushing into that scale aren't quite what we thought they would be. I wonder, as I thought about this section of the psalm for you and me, we could use a couple different images, sort of noisiness and chatter. We use the imagery of the balance of the scales and all the things we want to push into them. What are those spaces for you? In an attempt at only a slight bit of vulnerability, right? I'll tell you what this has looked like most recently for me. Maybe you can relate in some other way, but that oftentimes I have found, like, when I wake in the morning, there are times where at the moment of like consciousness, to be dramatic, right? I can immediately feel sort of the noisy chatter of my life, and immediately my mind is sort of caught up in like the things that I know need to be done for Park City, the things I think need to be done for Park City to be healthy and a place where disciples are formed and grown. Immediately I'm sort of confronted with, like, I'll be honest with you, sort of the things in my house, right? Just like, oh man, I know this needs attention and this needs attention. And I think about parenting, right? And you guys are like, man, I'll be praying for you, Matt. He sounds like you got some issues, right? I know a therapist you could talk to. All right, I start thinking about, recent conversations with my kids, moments of failure as a dad, or it's like present there in the moment. And in my mind, I can feel the struggle of, like, I want to sort of push things onto the scale to just say, and I got this bit of life under control. And I used to think that was a space just for, like, the intensely difficult seasons of my life. And maybe you are in one of those. But it's interesting to me that it's just as true for me in the sort of routine pressures of life. Right? What are you and I, what are we pushing sort of onto the scale to kind of balance life and show that our life has substance and weight? Maybe it's our performance. Maybe it's our performance vocationally, right? If I could just do a good enough job vocationally or civically as a citizen in my community, or economically, if I could just reach these markers, or parentally or morally, or all the markers of sort of significance that we have identified in life, that culture has identified, if I can just push enough things onto the scale of that balance, my life will have weight, it will have substance. The scales will tip finally in the right direction. The psalmist says, man, all of that is noise. This noise, maybe you feel that pressure, right? It's noise, he says. I mentioned last week we went to Humboldt, Kansas in an attempt to find a bit of quiet for our family. And it was lovely. We had a lovely time. But the first night we were there, all right, we were like the skylight in the little cabin thing we're sleeping in. You could see the stars, beautiful, dark, and quiet. Felt very, rural. And we're going to sleep, my kids, and like, we're sort of past the initial going to bed, and we're in the like drifting to sleep phase, and like sirens, so many sirens. I think they were sirens. I don't know what they were, but they were loud and long, and I was worried for whatever was going on. And in that moment, I was thinking, are you kidding me, right? like we have intentionally sort of stepped away from the noisy spaces of my life. And I was thinking about my kids. I'm like, oh, I got a kid. Sirens really set her off. She's going to be so anxious. And I'm like, we are here to rest. And I feel that move in the psalm is the admission. See, we sometimes think, man, the life of faith and following Christ was, once you make that decision, it's like smooth sailing. Well, this psalm admits, no. The silence into which we are invited happens within the context of all of this other noise, right? And all the ways in which we try to kind of quiet it, I think they're exposed in this prayer, which brings us to the final point. We start with the invitation to silence. We admit sort of the noise in our own lives and the noise around us. Well, what is the content of this silence? If it's a gift, what is its content? And we hear it in the final two verses. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this. Power belongs to God. And that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work. I, a while back, read a little book called You're Not Listening. Jess gave it to me. I'm just kidding, my wife. But it's called You're Not Listening, What You're Missing and Why It Matters. And she's writing about communication culturally, but she made this observation. Silence is like white space in design. It surrounds what's important. It surrounds what's important. And if we sort of take that into this psalm, the silence you and I are invited to, what's it surrounding? What is the important sort of thing it's drawing us into? Well, I think we hear it in verses 11 and 12. That the content of silence is that our lives are finally quiet, and what we hear in that moment is God speaking. God speaks. Power. He says, what do we hear God say? Power belongs to him. Steadfast love and justice belong to him as well. It's a beautiful picture, right? That when our lives are finally quiet enough, what we hear in that space is not just a sort of empty, sort of quiet. What we hear is a word of grace from God, that he has power, that he has steadfast love, and that he puts the world right. Justice. He is the one who assigns weight, that is his work in the world and not yours and mine. I was reminded of a joke from Norm Macdonald. You guys, the comedian Norm Macdonald, you can come on up. We're going to close with a song here. He's recently passed away, but he tells this joke about memory and remembering. Let me make sure I get it right here. He's like, he tells a story about Jim who was having memory trouble. So he went to his doctor, and his doctor gave him memory medication to help him with better recall. And later, right, Jim is chatting with his friend, telling him about how well the medicine works. His friend asks, well, how well does the medicine work? And Jim can't remember. He's like, oh man, what's the name of that flower? You know, that flower that you take on a date with a woman, that flower that you give, and his friend starts naming, he's like tulip and carnation, it's just naming these things, and I'm never going to nail Norm Macdonald's delivery, so I'm not even going to try, but Jim's like, no, the romantic one, red and long-stemmed, and finally the friend says, rose, and Jim's like, that's the one. Then he says, rose, what's the name of that medicine I take for memory, right? Right, I think that the thrust of this prayer is that we expend a lot of energy remembering all the wrong things. And the hope of the gospel, the silence that this prayer invites you and me into, is not that we have to remember, but that we are remembered. Not that we speak and therefore we are, but that another has spoken of us. A God who holds power, who holds steadfast love, and a God who works his justice in the world and in our lives, that those are his things to carry. And so I don't know what you carry into this moment this morning as you strive to sort of assert your weight and substance in the world, and whatever those markers might be for you. If I could just, well then, whatever those things are for you, my hope and prayer for you is that silence, the gracious silence of God would meet you in this moment. I want to invite you guys to stand. We're going to close with a song. And then briefly, we will dismiss with communion actually this morning. So I invite you to sing. And as we sing, I invite you to bring sort of all of that stuff into the silence and song of this moment.